The human brain is hardwired to seek pleasure. That's one of its jobs. Our brains are pretty much a gigantic network of neurons that try to school us into learning which behaviors are worthwhile and which ones aren't on a daily basis. And today, as countless people get hooked on things like drugs, technology, or social media, companies have actually hacked this system. From junk food to fast cars, businesses know how to promote products that are built for pleasure, even if they can harm you. Even doctors with good intentions sometimes prescribe certain painkillers that can send brains over the edge in a pleasure-driven loop of destructive behavior. But what actually happens to the brain of a person with addiction? It can start with the limbic system, also known as the reward center, unleashing the pleasurable chemical dopamine when the brain fulfills its craving. Over time, the recurring shot of dopamine can turn a compulsion into an addiction. The brain starts thinking it must have more of the drug or behavior. As the addictive behavior takes hold, the brain will rewire itself, making it harder to stop the destructive behavior. And if you're battling addiction, you are not alone. There are ways to get off this runaway train. One first step may be understanding how you got here, how your brain learned to reward this behavior. But the most important step is realizing there are ways out. Anyone who is suffering from an addiction should call your area's addiction hotline or contact the National Helpline from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services at 1-800-662-HELP and get control of your addiction and your brain.
The death penalty in the U.S. has been around since 1608, but it has long been debated under various presidential administrations. The death penalty, also known as capital punishment, can be used for crimes involving murder. Today, many states allow the death penalty. 24 states use it, 23 don't allow it, and 3 have a current moratorium or temporary hold on it. Since 1976, there have been 1,532 executions in total. The main method used is lethal injection, but other methods used in the past have been electrocution, hanging, death by firing squad, and gassing. The death penalty in America was influenced by England. The first person to be killed in the U.S. was Captain George Kendall in 1608, who was put to death by firing squad for serving as a Spanish spy. Since those early days, various high court rulings have placed limits on the death penalty. In 1972, the Supreme Court declared the death penalty a cruel and unusual punishment that violated the Eighth Amendment. For the next 4 years, no executions were carried out at the state or federal levels. But in 1976, the Supreme Court decided to allow it again, but with appellate review, meaning a higher court must review the decision of lower courts. The death penalty resumed the following year. In the 2000s, Supreme Court rulings abolished the death penalty for young people and people with intellectual disabilities. While the majority of people executed since 1976 have been white, a disproportionate number have been black. Black people make up about 13% of the population, but 42% of people on death row. The death penalty has also been criticized for putting innocent people on death row and for not serving as a deterrent to crime. The death penalty isn't cheap either. Defending a person facing the death penalty costs on average over $600,000 in a federal trial, about 8 times more than if the death penalty wasn't sought. This is because of longer trials and appeals when a person's life is on the line. For this reason, some prosecutors choose not to seek the death penalty. When you think of labor unions, you may think of this. For centuries, unions have been influencing the American workforce, but they're no longer just for blue-collar workers. A labor union is made up of workers in a particular industry or company. Members elect representatives to negotiate with their employer over issues like fair wages and safe working conditions. Many also provide members with health and retirement benefits. The first trade union was formed by Philadelphia shoemakers in 1794, and after that, local craft and trade unions began popping up in major cities as a result of the Industrial Revolution. For a long time, white male union members excluded immigrants, women, and black workers, so many of these workers formed their own unions. And it wasn't until 1867 that the National Union for Cigar Makers became the first to accept women and black workers. In the 1880s, national labor organizations formed, which led Congress to create the Department of Labor and pass legislation that gave employees overtime pay, a minimum wage, and the right to strike. Union membership skyrocketed during the Great Depression because unions offer more job security in uncertain times. It reached its peak in 1954, but membership has declined in the last 40 years, and in 2020, only about 11% of workers were part of a union. This is due to a number of factors, including new labor laws and job loss in industries that have historically been more unionized. The unions are still most common in the public sector, like education, government, and transportation. But now, young people are unionizing in new industries, like tech, digital media, and cannabis. Unions are also becoming more diverse, including more women and Black workers than ever before. Women have come a long way over the last century, earning the highest degrees, becoming CEOs, Hollywood moguls, and even vice president. But as many women are succeeding in male-dominated fields, they are still getting paid less than men. On average, a woman makes 82 cents for every dollar a man makes. This gap is even wider for women of color. For Black women, it's 63 cents. For Native American women, it's 60 cents. And for Latina women, it's 55 cents. This is due to a combination of gender and race discrimination and gender expectations that influence what jobs women take and how much they get paid. One example of this is the motherhood penalty, which describes how mothers are at a disadvantage in the workplace. Women are often expected to handle the majority of childcare and housework on top of a full-time job, so they end up taking significant time off or leaving the workforce altogether. This makes them more likely to be denied promotions when they come back to work. That's also why women are more likely to seek jobs that have more time flexibility, and those are often lower-paying roles. But women who aren't mothers still face gender bias and the motherhood penalty because of assumptions that eventually they will have children and therefore won't be working as much. This disparity in pay only gets worse as a woman progresses in her education and her career, and it's even worse for Black and Latina women. At the executive level, a woman still makes 95 cents for every dollar a man makes. When it comes to representation, women make up 21% of executive managers, while women of color only make up 3%. One common misconception is that women don't ask for raises as often as men do. But the truth is, women ask for raises just as often as men do, but are only successful 15% of the time, whereas men are successful 20% of the time. The average woman loses over $400,000 over her lifetime because of the gender wage gap, and Black and Latina women lose around $1 million. Electric cars may seem like the wave of the future, but they actually already had their heyday in the early 1900s. That is, until Henry Ford's Model T and the discovery of cheap gas came along. But today, electric cars are having a comeback. Electric vehicles, or EVs, are much more environmentally friendly than gas-powered vehicles, but they aren't as perfectly clean as you might think. While they do run fully off electricity using a battery for power, and emit no greenhouse gases while running, they do produce some pollution, just indirectly. The minerals used in their batteries are mined from the earth, and this mining process often releases toxic dust and requires lots of water. Their batteries can also weigh up to 1,000 pounds, so moving them and processing them contributes to carbon dioxide emissions. Electric cars also need electricity to run, and that electricity has to come from somewhere. It can come from a coal plant, which is a big source of emissions, or it can come from a lower polluting source like natural gas, wind, or solar energy. In other words, how clean the car is depends on the source of the electricity. But electric cars are still more environmentally friendly than cars that run on fossil fuels like gasoline and diesel, which release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. If you remember from science class, carbon dioxide is one of many greenhouse gases that trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere and contribute to global warming. The US transportation sector is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Globally, EVs represent only about 3% of car sales, but that number is growing. China is the largest carbon dioxide polluter in the world, but it actually has the largest stock of electric cars and the largest fleet of electric buses. In the US, California has the highest number of electric vehicle registrations. As EVs become more popular in the US, one challenge the government will face is how to earn revenue, because currently, gas tax revenues fund much of the upkeep of the nation's highways. This digital meme of a flying Pop-Tart cat was an internet sensation back in 2011. It's now considered a type of crypto art and sold for almost $600,000. It may sound crazy to pay that much for something you can find online for free, but people are still dishing out millions for these unique digital collector's items, known as NFTs. NFT stands for non-fungible token, which means something that's not interchangeable. These two $20 bills are worth the same amount, but these two NFTs are not. Think of them as concert tickets. Each ticket contains specific information, like your seat number and date of the show, so you can't trade one for another. NFTs can represent anything from videos to tweets to music albums, but the NFT isn't the item itself. It's actually a piece of code, similar to a serial number, that identifies where the item is and who owns it. Here's how the process works. First, the creator attaches an NFT or unique piece of code to their item. Then they put the item up for sale on an online marketplace. Once a buyer has purchased the item with cryptocurrency, that transaction is recorded on the blockchain, which is a public database of transactions for everyone to see. Other people may still be able to find, share, and make copies of your digital item online, but the blockchain would show that you own the original one. By buying an NFT, you essentially get to own a piece of the internet. It's similar to collecting baseball cards and sneakers, in that they hold sentimental value, give the owner bragging rights, and have the potential to be worth more in the future. While NFTs can be traced back to 2012, they didn't become mainstream until recently. But along with all the hype, there are some concerns. Critics say NFTs don't actually hold any value and will fizzle out eventually. They also say it can be difficult to verify that the person selling the NFT is actually the original creator, leaving room for scammers to take advantage of online marketplaces. Every year, the Earth gets hotter and hotter, leaving climate activists and world leaders eager to find a solution. In 2015, a global initiative was formed, and the Paris Climate Agreement was born. The Paris Climate Agreement got its name from the location where it was signed, but has very little to do with the city. Nearly 200 countries signed onto the treaty when it began. Currently, 189 remain in it. In 2017, President Trump announced he would pull out as well, but the US rejoined under President Biden in 2021. Many Republican leaders have spoken out against the climate treaty, claiming it gives foreign countries like China and India an edge over the US because countries are allowed to set their own climate goals. The goal of the Paris Climate Agreement is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial times, preferably to limit it by 1.5 degrees. In pre-industrial times, the Earth's average land ocean temperature was negative 0.16 degrees Celsius. We are currently at 1.02 degrees Celsius. One of the achievements many countries and cities have achieved so far, reducing carbon emissions in the power and transportation sectors. Scientists say the treaty's plans to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide will prevent a dangerous increase in global temperatures. Experts predict the global climate will increase by 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030, which will result in changing conditions that will put agriculture, health, water supply, and more at risk. In 2020, most Americans were stuck in quarantine, but US companies were not. Despite the pandemic, nearly 500 US companies went public, the highest number in 20 years. Here are 3 ways a company can enter the stock market. When a private company becomes public, it means it's selling shares of its business to the public on a stock exchange, in hopes of raising money and growing their business. The most traditional way is an IPO, or initial public offering. It involves hiring what are called underwriters, who are often investment banks, who facilitate the process and charge a fee. Before going public, they take the company on a roadshow across the country to drum up interest from institutional investors like banks and hedge funds. This helps them decide on the initial stock price based on how investors react. It also lets them make plans with investors to buy shares when the stock hits the market. Another way to go public is through a direct listing. This way, a company sells shares directly to the public without the help of underwriters. This process is cheaper than a traditional IPO, but without the underwriters, there's no guarantee that shares will sell. The latest trend on Wall Street is to go public with a SPAC, a special purpose acquisition company. Its only purpose is to take a company public. They're generally formed by a team of experts from a certain industry, which includes politicians, celebrities, and even athletes. A SPAC first raises money through an IPO, then it merges with a private company to transform it into a public company. Like when DraftKings, the online sports betting company, hit the market in 2020, it was with the help of the SPAC. People who invested in the SPAC don't really know what they're buying until after the merger is announced, and this is why SPACs are often called blank check companies. This method is more attractive to smaller companies that would have had trouble raising enough money without the SPAC. It's also faster than a traditional IPO, which has way more paperwork and can take up to a year to complete. As Attorney General, Merrick Garland is the country's top lawyer and law enforcement officer, and it's a job often caught up in controversy. Here's what it's like to be the top cop. As head of the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, or AG, oversees all federal law enforcement agencies, including the FBI and the Drug Enforcement Administration, in addition to 93 U.S. attorneys in federal court districts across the country. The Attorney General offers legal counsel to the President and the heads of other executive departments, and oversees criminal prosecutions on behalf of the government. Every state plus Washington, D.C. also has their own Attorney General. They do more or less the same things as the federal AG, just at the local level. The biggest difference is in how they get the job. At the state level, most are elected by voters. At the federal level, the Attorney General is nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, just like everyone else in the cabinet. But unlike the other members of the cabinet, the Attorney General is supposed to be politically independent of the President. In other words, the Attorney General should decide what to investigate and who to prosecute, even if it conflicts with the President's interests. This doesn't always work out, though, because the President has the power to pick someone who's loyal to them and shares their political views. For example, Trump said his AG Bill Barr could defend him from lawsuits, but Biden says his pick, Merrick Garland, represents the country. We can trace this process back to the Judiciary Act of 1789, which organized the Supreme Court and created the position of the Attorney General. Earlier versions of the act gave the Supreme Court the power to choose the Attorney General, but that wasn't included in the final version, so President George Washington decided to pick the Attorney General, and that became the norm.